Welcome to Status Check with Spivey, where we talk about life, law school admissions, a little bit of everything. Today, we're sort of getting out our crystal ball, a PowerScore word, because I'm joined with PowerScore's CEO, many-year expert on law school aptitude test, the LSAT, standardized test. And what we're looking at is three things. We're looking at this cycle, the tail end of the cycle, how things might shake up on the wait list. We're looking at next cycle with two different perspectives, how the number of applicants and the competitiveness vis-a-vis number of applicants might look next cycle, and also how that LSAT bell curve in the LSAT in general is going to look next cycle. So without further delay, I have a good friend, longtime friend on, and let's turn it over to me and Dave. Hey, Dave.
Mike, how are you doing today?
I am busy traveling and well. I'm traveling to, do I want to say? I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm traveling to Washington, D.C. I do want to say I have a heartwarming story.
Oh, let's hear it.
I posted a poll on Reddit, and I was like, all right, I'm going to be in D.C., and I actually booked my trip a day earlier than I should have, and I didn't realize it until last week. So I have a free day in D.C., and I was like, okay, I can podcast with the Dean of Admissions in D.C. I could track down a big law hiring partner. I could podcast with the DOJ. I could go visit PI, or I can enjoy a rare day off. And I did a poll, and Reddit told me to take the rare day off next Tuesday. So I will sleep in.
You did that, and then you settled for a podcast with me. So seems like it all worked out for you.
It's always a pleasure to do a podcast with you. I think there's a lot of stuff we have to announce.
Yeah, it's been a minute since you and I last sat down and talked about some of these things. So first off, Mike, I got to ask, what are you drinking for this podcast?
Do you want the real answer or PowerScore answer?
I want your PowerScore answer first.
This is Mike Spivey, Nashville, Tennessee. I'm drinking Mad Dog.
Well, that was pretty good. We're going to let you into the official podcast club on the PowerScore side. I wish I could say I was drinking Mad Dog, but I am instead drinking tea because I have a sore throat.
Hopefully you're not foggy headed. You have a cold coming on, Dave?
I don't know. It's allergies that I'm sure are the problem. But I'll be fine. And the beautiful thing is that numbers don't lie. So it doesn't really matter how I feel. We'll be able to tell the ultimate truth.
I think we're going to see a pathway where people can lie about numbers. How to Lie with Statistics. Have you read that book?
Yes, I've read it many, many times. I see it every day in marketing too. So
exactly. So I'm just drinking coffee and water. We have an announcement at the end.
A big announcement that we will get to, but let's first dive into the idea of what's going on with this cycle now that we're getting pretty close to the end here.
Yeah, it's been a predictably interesting cycle. So those are two separate words. We sort of knew going in it was going to be a slow cycle because of what happened last year. And schools that pulled the trigger early last year tended to get hurt. And if we can see it, schools can see it. So this year, as we predicted, schools have gone incredibly slowly. The other interesting variable there is when you look at the volume between June and November of the cycle was 90% of the same volume as last year, 97%. So to admissions officers, they were saying, oh, wow, we're going to have another super high year. But when you look at January through April, 24% down versus last year, 30% down in first-time test takers, which I'll get back to why that's interesting when we talk about next year. So things picked up as far as dropping off. We're currently sitting at 11% down versus last year, which if you're an applicant is good news, but there's that scoring disproportion. And there's also the fact, Dave, that schools are by and large going to lower their class sizes. Most schools I talk to seem to be heading in that direction. So we'll probably end up negative 11%, right around there. What's the negative class size? How much have schools under admitted? And that will determine what happens off the wait list. I got to tell you, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. No one really knows for sure what's going to happen with the wait list. And I'm referencing the deans of admissions I talk to every week. Because of that disproportion at the top, I think there's going to be wait list movement. I'm just not sure where it's going to start.
Let's get to that in a moment because I want to dive into the way that will actually work a little bit. Let's start with each of the kind of like statistical pieces of what's been occurring here. So you noted the fact that we're down about 11% in applicants. And it's been varying for the last couple of weeks, anywhere from like 10.7% down to like 11.2%. So I do think given where we are about 90% of the way through the cycle, we're looking around 11%. It is interesting, though, that when you go back a few years, that does mean that even though we're down this year, we're still up a little bit Not compared to last year, obviously, but to say the year before and, the years before that. Do you have a sense of how much we're actually up
I
overall
do.
compared to those years?
So we're 11% down from the crazy year last year. We have 7.1% more than 2019, 2020, 3.4% more than 2018, 2019, and 4.4% more than 2018, 2019. It's kind of interesting because an LSAT spokesperson was quoted last week in an article as saying, this continues to confirm our position that the 2021, 2022 admission cycle is not as red hot off the charts as 2020, 2001. Correct. I agree. When it comes to applications, but still significantly higher than the three previous cycles. Well, as you can see from what I just mentioned, we're only significantly ahead of 2019, 2020. And that's if you call 7.1% up significant. The other two ones, 3.4% and 4.4%, it seems like we're heading towards normal stability. And I think next year, it's not even going to be significant at all. It's going to be level versus those years.
Yeah, I think maybe what we just had was we just had an LSAT definition provided for us as to what significant means to them, because apparently 3 to 4% is significant in their eyes. I don't know that I agree that it's significant, but that's what they're actually saying there. But it is interesting when you think about it from an application standpoint to realize that last year was brutal in so many different ways, one of which was that there was a big rise in applicants. And then this year, everybody thinks, oh, they're down, so we're in such a better position. You're in an improved position, but you're still slightly worse off in terms of applicant volumes compared to prior years. So that's one of the reasons that this cycle, I think, has been a little bit slower, is there's more people to deal with compared to the baseline of the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, a little bit more versus the baseline. I would argue that 3.3 and 4.4 are really significant. That's the normal ebb and flow of admissions. I don't understand it. Last year, when things are way off the charts, LSAC wants to say that things are normal. And this year, when they're normal, they want to say they're red hot. I don't quite understand this need to opine about everything's looking great always. It's status quo. I get trying to keep the market calm, but this is just data. It's just data.
Whatever it does is what it does. Opinions can be made about just about anything, but the fact is we can look at the numbers and compare it to prior years and get an exact sense of how they stand up next to each other. What you and I might choose to call it versus what someone else calls it, that's where the opinion comes in. And obviously, over the last couple of years, we've seen people have a lot of different opinions about various pieces here, and they weren't always right when they claimed that we're going to see a score bubble go away or that numbers are going to drop back down to normal. I like to see it returning closer to a baseline. If you're an applicant, you still have to deal with several percent more fellow applicants. Is that the end of the world? No. As you said, that actually does kind of like roller coaster a little bit. That's a normal thing that you see within these cycles. Let's talk about that score bubble, though, because clearly that's been a topic of some great interest. I poke fun at you on Twitter about the word bubble every time I can now, because I know that you will probably respond with an angry face emoji.
Yeah, it's just disproportionate growth to me would be the precise term, but
I really don't know why you hate the word bubble so much, but I like it. So I like saying it a lot. You might hear it a lot more in this podcast.
well, there's a bubble going on at the top, right? So that's problematic. I think we just tweeted if anyone wants to go check out either one of our Twitter accounts. Scores are still high at the top. The LSAT today is not the same LSAT as it was 3 years ago. 3 years ago, it was a test in person, 5 sections, and you got to absorb all the nervous jitters in a non-state dependent learning environment of the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a completely different than the 3-section at-home test where your parents 2 minutes before the test or your friends or whatever can shout words of, you got this, Killoran.
You can do it.
Shoulder massage. And now it's a 4-section. So it's 3 different tests. I don't think the GRE has changed in something like 18 years, right?
It's changed because they've done various things with their test adaptivity and so forth. But content-wise, they've flowed it in a very consistent way. I mean, they've had their digital transformation and everything. And there have been changes, but I would argue that they haven't been in the last decade anything as significant as what we just saw with the LSAT. It's funny because I was talking to LSAC personnel yesterday, and one of the things that I mentioned was it would be great if you could release all sorts of data about the various pieces of performance that we're seeing, about applicants, about scores, but certainly one that I've heard you call on before is to release a study that compares results of the regular paper and pencil LSAT to then the LSAT Flex, and then now to today's LSAT. And I definitely second that request because that would put to bed all the concerns, all the rumors, all the claims, really. Because when I talk to them, they're like, look, there's no difference between these tests. The experimental or no experimental doesn't make a difference. Placement of the experimental doesn't make a difference. Yet you and I both know in our hearts, we're not totally buying that.
I'm not buying it at all. Talk to the kid I talked to on the phone a couple of days ago who scored a 173 years ago. That 173 years ago does not equate to a 170 today. Can they act on that? No. The best thing LSAC could do would be to talk to U.S. News and World Report. Here's our validity study, and can you equalize these things? That would have helped last year too, admitting to that, because in 3 years from now, we're going to see a flooded employment market because schools weren't hearing anything about the increase last year. If the market is level or recessive, I am going to be talking to a lot of really understandably concerned, unemployed graduating students because law school's over-enrolled. Because again, I would say that the messaging isn't arguably off. It was definitively off last year.
Yeah, well, that validity study that you're asking for, I don't think that we're going to get it. And if it did turn out that it showed that the two tests were different in the way they, had certain results, and again, you and I believe that to be the case. I have heard LSAC spokespeople say that that is not the case. So it's important to, at least put their position out here. We could all put this to rest by just putting it down in black and white. Give us the study, show us the results, end of conversation. If they are, in fact, divergent, I don't think we're going to see any kind of information on that for years because that doesn't benefit their purposes. And I don't think they would go to U.S. News and World Report because I think they think they're the devil. They're almost in a logjam situation with that. But let's actually focus on the scoring bubble. And I'll say bubble one more time, just for the sake of people who are listening here. This morning, you and I were talking, and your data person, Justin Kane, did a fantastic job of sending around some information saying, hey, let's take a look at what's happening. And for those of you who are listening who aren't really familiar with the scoring bubble that we're talking about, Mike, if you don't mind, I'll just read off the scores over the last 5 years in the 175 to 180 range.
Justin screenshots the data every single day, and he has for the last 6 years, and he accounts for it, I think, a little bit more precisely. So this data might differ slightly than LSAC, but we'll explain on our blog how we come with our data versus how they come with their data.
Yeah, I have thoughts on that. And I know LSAC does as well. So they shared that with me. They're like, well, sometimes schools restate data, but we're not going to worry about that fact right now. We're going to worry about this from a standpoint of showing numerically what the difference is if you're at the top of the LSAT scoring scale. So again, LSAT goes from 120 to 180, scores from 175 to 180 are at the median or the 75th percentile of pretty much every school out there. 5 years ago, in 2017, 2018 cycle, at this point in time, we had 701 individuals who had scores in that range. The following year, you have 540. So it actually went down. The year after that, you had 633. And these kind of fluctuations are not abnormal at all. It moves around.
25 years you've been seeing those minor fluctuations.
Yes, although the early year data wasn't as widely disclosed.
Oh, that's right. We used to get it in law schools, but it wasn't public.
Exactly. In the early days, I didn't have the ability to say, hey, what's happened yesterday? Or what are the actual numbers? I wish I knew you back then. You could have given me some insider info, but it wasn't to be at that point in time. Interestingly enough, it's one of the things I do like about the situation that we have today is we have a lot of score transparency comparative to what we had, say, 15 years ago. Now, those three numbers from kind of like 5, 4, and 3 years ago, they're 701, 540, and 633. Then when you get to 2020, 2021, it goes up to 1,441. This is the scoring bubble. Over a 100% increase at this point in terms of scores that are just in the 175 to 180. And you think about what that does at the top, it creates a huge amount of pressure because there's a ton more people with incredibly high scores. All right, that was last year. What do we have going on right now? Has it returned back to that 700 range? No, it's at 1,266. It is still really close to what it was previously. We still have a big bubble in terms of just like the number of scores that are out there.
Let me throw in even one more variant in there. If you look at scores under 150, they're getting fewer and fewer. So what you're seeing is as a proportion, even the higher scores of people who are applying to most law schools are getting more compressed, more competitive.
If we went back and we looked at each of the 5-point segments, like 170 to 174, we see the same thing. In that range, for example, 5 years ago, you had 2,455 people sitting there. Today, we have 3,641. There's just more high scores floating around out there. And that is despite the fact that you've seen a 10, 11% drop in applicants that are in the system right now.
What's going on this cycle is you have slower admission pace, incredibly predictable. You have this disproportionate growth at the top of the LSAT bands. So how's it going to break? Again, no one can really tell you. I think there's going to be waitlist movement much more than last year. Last year is interesting, Dave. It was a hard stop. It was a hard stop. And there were months where you wouldn't see more than 1 or 2 scatter plot admits. And I've never seen that in 22 years of admissions. There will be waves this year. I just don't know where the waves will originate. They might originate near the top if the top school is really underadmitted. Maybe Georgetown underadmitted or Texas, large schools that could trigger big waves. And waves generally happen off the wait list and domino effects. So Texas admits 75, 100 off the wait list, and I'm just making this up. I don't know what they're going to do. And then that trickles down and it gathers force because schools below start. So, that's the definition of the wave. The wave gets bigger and bigger, just like a wave coming in from the tide. But I don't know where they're going to start.
I think that's one of the interesting questions is when do we see the movement? The other thing is Justin pointed out that the applicants this year are submitting more applications, which should accelerate the size of the waves. I think he said that this year there's about 7.15 applications per applicant. Last year it was 7.03. The year before that it was 6.42. So you have people who are saying, it's been a little bit troublesome. Maybe I'll apply to an extra school, and broadening the scope. That means if they're getting waitlisted or holding acceptances and waiting for another school, one person is actually having a greater effect this year than they did in either of the prior 2 years.
One data point, that sort of example of this. I talked to someone last week who saw that I tweeted that I would talk to people struggling. I don't think she would say she's struggling. She was admitted to Stanford the day I talked to. She's been admitted to Yale and Harvard.
That's a struggle.
Exactly. But she's probably been admitted to 9 of the top 10, let's say. Well, if she was admitted to 9 of the top 10 and she applied to 10 versus maybe in years past, she would apply to 5 or 6. A lot of people applied to more schools this year because of last year's bloodbath. So what's happening is if she's admitted to 9 of 10, she's saying no to 8 schools. Now multiply that by not just this one person I talked to, but by the market. And yeah, you could see significant melting. And I'm optimistic there's going to be significant waitlist melting. I am, because of that increase in applications per applicant. I'm just not sure where it's going to start because, Harvard took a large deferment class from last year. They deferred a lot of people. So they might not need to admit typically off the wait list. We're still dealing with some of these second generational consequences of last year's cycle within this cycle.
That's a really good point because it's easy to think, all right, these are discrete units that have no impact on each other. But last year, quite notably, does have an impact on this year because of so many people flowing in. And then also a lot of people opting out at the end saying, I don't like any of my results. I'm going to push my applications to this year.
Justin and I were talking about that this morning. At its max, applications were down 11.6%, and now they're down 10.9, 11%. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of looking at that. And my theory was by this time last year, people were like, I'm out. I'm not applying. Justin aptly brought up, and I think LSAC has aptly brought this up too. Well, there was a March test this year. There wasn't a March test last year. So It could just be that test is filling the market a little bit.
It is, although this April test, as we know, is tiny. We're closing down on this cycle, and this April test is going to be, I think, the smallest on record when we're all said and done with this. It's already small. It's going to melt some more. Let's shift over to that next cycle because I think we get a sense that the wait lists are going to move. It's also April 15th, so we're starting to see some big keystone dates come through here with deposits and people responding. And I think that's when we'll start to see schools getting a much healthier picture of, all right, who's coming here, who's moving elsewhere. That should trigger some waves. I'm optimistic here in the next couple of weeks that we'll see some movement finally.
Yeah, and this is why we do these podcasts, because I think that having other sources to give stabs at this is important. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be right all the time. But here's what we're seeing. April, that's going to be at least, and this is the most conservative estimate of all time, a third less significant as far as test takers than last year, a third smaller. Then you're seeing June. There's only 12 more days to register for June. So when you calculate that people can register over these 12 days, but then you're going to have a lot of people not take the June test. Last year, that was 40%. 40% of June test takers who registered last year either took a different date or didn't take it all. That's significant. So if you hold that steady and you're conservative holding it steady, that sort of melting. So if you look at conservatively, we need 1,000 registrants a day for June for the next 12 straight days to equalize last year's June. Point being this, April is going to be significantly down. June highly likely is going to be significantly down. What is the proportion of first-time test takers? You and I don't know. But if that proportion is normalized and stable, what you're going to see is these are 2 of 5 leading indicators that next cycle should have a diminished number of applicants.
Yeah, and this particular cycle has been bad for first-time test takers. They've been down at a greater rate than the applicants themselves. And part of that's the spillover from last year. But I think when you sit down and take a look at what's happening with the next 2 LSATs, they're not going to suddenly close out this year and equalize everything. They're coming in pretty small. And for those of you who are like, what do you mean like you lose students? The melting of enrollment occurs along the following lines. You get to the final day of registration, and that's where you max out with the number of people who are registered for an LSAT. So let's say there were 20,000 people registered for a particular LSAT, like June. At that point, from there until the actual test date, people make decisions where they're like, I don't want to take it. I'm not ready. I need to take the next LSAT instead. And so you start to see the enrollment numbers for the LSAT actually drop. That's the melt that we're talking about. Then on the days of the test itself, you see a fairly significant attrition because some people wake up and they're like, I don't feel well, or there's a bunch of noise in my apartment building, or my roommate's being a jerk. And so you lose even more people on those test days. So you may start with 20,000, and then all of a sudden on the actual test day, you're down at 12,000 or 13,000 for that administration. That's kind of what we're talking about, where it gets smaller once it peaks.
I have a memory of my freshman year in college where I got a couple shirts dry cleaned. I had a job interview with
I went fancy in college, man.
Well, no, but I never went and picked them up. For all I know, 30 years later, they're still sitting in that dry.
They're standing there and they're like spivey shirts.
So, it's understandable to me that a college junior or senior, if I'm not picking up my dry cleaning, they certainly might say, I'm pumping the brakes on taking this LSAT today. That's understandable. When we say losing people, Thanos isn't snapping his fingers and making 50% of test takers here. But last year, we lost 40% of June test takers. So that'll happen.
And I think actually taking the test at home makes it more likely that people will withdraw because there's absolutely no penalty. No one really knows. Your friends weren't all driving over to the test site with you to take the exam. It's just you. And so I think the barrier taking yourself out of the pool is as low as it has ever been. I would love to see stats on that over the years.
That's like a Malcolm Gladwell-esque piece. Or, I remember reading a research study about finding parents for being late, for dropping off their kids. And when they started finding them, if they didn't pick up their kids on time, their picking up rate got worse.
It was too small. Yeah.
So they didn't feel any guilt anymore.
Oh, $2 for you to watch my kid for an extra half hour? Oh, that's good. That's a great babysitting fee.
Exactly. We've reached out to Gladwell about some other stuff going on. It would be really interesting to take a deep dive.
I'm sure. That does sound interesting. So let's move fully into this next cycle then and talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen. Let's start with applicant numbers for next year as compared to this year. What are your thoughts there?
There's 5 factors that make me optimistic if you're applying next year. Although, let me just disclaimer, as an individual, you know your situation much more than Dave and I know your situation. So please don't make an individual decision based on this podcast if you've already gotten into some good schools this year. Because Dave and I, we've been wrong.
I don't even recall a time.
There's 5 indicators that next cycle should be a little bit down and more lenient. As we mentioned, April's down, June's going to likely be down. Here's another one, reapplicants will be down. This year, you had a pool flooded with reapplicants because of how difficult last cycle was. At that sort of applicant level, you have 3 leading indicators. Then you have class sizes. That pendulum always swings every other year. That's a rapidly swinging pendulum. Down this year, they will be up next year. More seats for law school students. Better if you're an applicant. And then here's the other interesting demographic variable. Since 2015, number of college students has gone down as far as people enrolled in colleges. That's rare. I'm going to make up a number here. This is going to be so up. But since like 1960 to 2015, that number was going up. We've lived through this. My parents went to college. They were like 1 in 10. And then when I went to college wasn't college. It was like master's degree was college. And then, that even accelerated. So The demographics are in favor of people applying next year. And it's easier for people to put off college or law school, even because the job market is more lucrative. It's probably easier to say, hey, I want a year to work and get experience. Instead of making $16 an hour, I'll make 22 or 25 or 26.
You have greater choice now in terms of your options, and you're not financially penalized by staying in the job market. A lot of times, if somebody finds out, hey, I'm thinking about going to law school, then they have an incentive to say, well, let's give you a retention bonus.
If you're getting a retention bonus, you might be putting off college, you might be putting off law school. So if the employment situation stays the same, that would be a sixth reason why we see diminishment in applications next year.
I can't really quibble with any of the reasons there. I thought for a while that there's no possible way that next year would be worse than this year. There were too many positive factors, and you've just named, I think, very comprehensively all the major ones, including one or two that I hadn't thought about. So I would have to agree with you. So if someone's out there and they're saying to themselves, all right, I'm just getting into this process and I am looking to apply next fall, the picture is going to continue to get better. So that's the very first thing. What do you think happens as far as LSAT scores and what we see with the so-called bubble that exists? Is that going to change at all?
It's more your area than mine. Let's assume, and I don't know anything about this. Let's assume it's the same test this coming year. Will it be scored the same? I mean, because right now, again, I'm not a psychometrician. I have talked to psychometricians. I'm not people I'm saying, hey, can you say this in the media? I'm just talking. And they're saying, when we see something go from 600 to 1,200 or from double in the 170 to 174 range, and we look at long-term patterns, these are anomalistic outliers. It shouldn't happen like this. The human gene isn't getting smarter in a year. People aren't getting smarter. I was told by someone at LSAC that, well, their grades are getting stronger, so that would track with higher LSAT scores. No, I have 60 books in my library, my at-home library, about how over the last 50 years, it's been a consumer-based education market, not an apprentice-based education market. Mm-hmm. So GPAs are going up because of the consumerism, not because people are getting smarter. If that were the case, the LSAT scores would go up this year. I guess what I'm curious about is, do they score it the same?
Fortunately, I've got this one. So the baseline understanding that they've put out is that the LSAT will remain in its current form through at least 2024. And I think now that they've reinstated the experimental section, we're going to see this continue on. For me, this is likely to be the format of the LSAT indefinitely. I know a number of people are thinking, well, I don't want to take it at home, or I'm looking for that moment when we can actually go back to paper and pencil. But I'm not sure the cost factors involved here are going to make that compelling for LSAC. It's really extraordinarily difficult to organize hundreds of test sites across the US and get students and proctors. And of course, as you might recall, now the hardware that they would go back to, because they were using tablets as opposed to the paper and pencil format before we hit the pandemic. And I think that's just a huge logistical nightmare. And so I don't think that that's something that they really want to get back into, when right now, all that stuff with tablets, all that stuff with kind of like finding university proctors and university rooms is gone. So I think the at-home test is going to be the default going forward. I think the structure that they have works for them. 3 sections plus 1 experimental, take the LSAT writing on a separate day or in a separate session at least. I think this is our LSAT probably indefinitely. So they've said basically through 2024, this is it, but I wouldn't be surprised to come back in 5 years and see this being the test. The second thing is if you're going to keep everything else the same and you're already producing results on this scoring scale with the metrics that they have, why change it? They've committed to the idea that this test provides a standard of measurement that is as good as prior versions. So the more changes that you insert into that system, the more points of error and problem that you introduce. If you're getting away with it right now, so to speak, and it's working, why wouldn't you keep it exactly the same? So with test structure staying the same, test format staying the same, this is to me the LSAT as it will be for quite a while now.
Okay, so you would guess that we're just going to see a long-term shift in the proportionality of LSAT scores that mimics or mirrors, obviously not perfectly, the shift we've seen this year. Not last year when it was a 3-section test, but more normalized for this year's scoring bandwidths.
Yeah, we may end up with a distribution curve that is not entirely normal. Everybody's familiar with those bell curves where the majority of people score in the middle. around the 151 point on the LSAT. And now we have this little kind of like bubble bump, whatever you want to call it, in the upper register. And I don't foresee that changing. Now, there are things that they could do that would alter it. And we've suggested this to them. In fact, we've asked them on multiple occasions to consider the idea of score choice, where you wouldn't have to submit scores that you didn't want to law schools. We've also suggested that they give you an instantaneous raw score at the end of the test. That in particular could really change a distribution curve, because if somebody said, all right, I wonder how I did, and they got an immediate raw score and it allowed them to cancel, if they didn't reach a number that they thought was sufficient, you could see droves of people in the lower register of scores canceling.
Right.
So there are features they could add to this test that would change the distribution, but that doesn't change the scoring of it per se.
I took the GMAT so many years ago, but I got my score back after this is like, we're talking 20 something years ago, and I got my score back immediately.
You see this on different tests, like the GMAT. Different tests, they have different features, but getting an immediate raw score, like you finish the test and then within a minute, a raw score comes to the screen and says, this is an unofficial score, but this is where it looks like an actual scaled score. We think you got a 600 or whatever the case might be. We know tests do that. So if other major standardized tests can do it, that means there's not a test integrity issue with that. And then there is score choice as well, which is used by different exams. And score choice is simply a process where you say, all right, I don't want to submit every one of my test results. I just want to submit one or two of them. So obviously you choose your best scores, and that can kind of change the way people think about applying, but it doesn't change the way the test itself is scored.
What does the dental aptitude test do? Because I think we should benchmark based on
the DAT and the OAT.
What's the OAT? I've never even heard of this thing.
I think it's the ophthalmology.
Oh my God, I'm going to take it.
The DAT has a spatial reasoning section on it. So
no,
it's kind of cool.
It's an April Fool's prank when I said that there was going to be a spatial reasoning on the LSAT.
I missed that.
That was horrible. It caused like a 12-hour panic.
That's power in the marketplace. So ultimately, going back to this upcoming cycle, all signs are pointing towards stability on the LSAT side. And that may mean, that we do have a bubble still with higher scores, but I think the test will stay the same and we can kind of feel good about that aspect. The less change, the better. And then you've, I think, persuasively argued that we're going to see a little bit easier of a cycle in all likelihood. A few more spaces available, a few less applicants. So things getting better next year as compared to this year and certainly the last year.
Very much at the macro level, I feel like the pendulum is still swinging back and it's going to stabilize right around normal levels next year as far as demand and interest in legal education.
Do you have anything more to add about that upcoming cycle?
No, I'll just explain that this is early. This is the earliest we've ever talked about the upcoming cycle. What I don't want to sound like is like we know what's going to happen. I'm optimistic, but I wouldn't say I'm certain. Far from it. What's the quote I just put up on Reddit? No amount of sophistication about your past knowledge will allay the fact that you know nothing about the future. Things can change.
I would say this. You're 100% right. Barring significant social, structural type of change, I would probably put money that we are likely right on this. So there's no guarantees in life. But if I had to go to the great LSAT law school admissions casino in the sky and put down money on what's going to happen next cycle, I would say I think we're 95% on the money with this. The caveats still apply. Something can always occur that changes that, and who knows about it. But right now, that's the way it's looking, I think.
That great casino in the sky, what it does is it hits your need for your dopaminergic pathways to fire intermittent reward. And I learned that from Dr. Judson Brewer. He was on our podcast. So if you want to check out a podcast, and then we'll make an announcement about decreasing anxiety levels test day, that one with Dr. Brewer, I thought was really helpful.
Intermittent reward sounds like the story of my life. So yeah. Well, there is one factor next cycle I think that'll be different than the past cycles. And that is that you and I have been working on a project here for the past, well, it feels like a year. It's probably longer than that. I'll cede the floor to you on what we've been working on.
Not just you and I working on this, but Karen Bottenbaum, who's at my firm, who was the director of admissions at Harvard Law School, 12 years she was at Harvard. Anna Hicks, our firm COO, who got into something like 7 of the top 10 law schools and went to UVA on a Dillard, so they paid her to go to law school. The four of us are in that doc. Sometimes I see you guys in there, and sometimes I feel lonely when it's just me. And that will be a book. Is it going to be the PowerScore's / Spivey Consulting Admissions Bible?
Law School Admissions Bible. We're adding another kind of volume, a special volume, I like to think of it, in the LSAT Bible series. This one focusing on admissions, and obviously the expertise that we both have on the LSAT side and the admissions side, I think will be really useful. It is coming together, and right now that should be out this fall. We're targeting September or October as the release date. And if you're interested in learning more about that, especially as we release news and information, what I would invite you to do for now is to go to the PowerScore.com website and put yourself on our mailing list specifically for this book. It's PowerScore.com / one big word, admissions book. And that will allow you to kind of go in there, add your name, and then when we kind of like give updates, and then we'll launch a pre-sale for this as well directly through the website, you can get that availability. But that book should be out right as the cycle is opening. And I know already that is full of a number of really good tips and pieces of information about how to shape your application and to deal with certain situations that maybe a lot of people haven't heard covered before.
Well, you know what maybe we could do, Dave, is put a snippet in the next month or two from the book. Here's the challenge of admissions. Let's move outside your view GPA and your LSAT or GRE. You've never rendered a single admission decision in your life, and highly likely, nor has the person helping you with your application. So it's virtually impossible to see things the way a dean of admissions or an admissions decision maker sees things. The whole point of this book is we have two former people who made admissions decisions writing it from the perspective of how admissions officers make admissions decisions. I think that's going to be helpful, and I think there's a need for this in the market.
I would agree, because it's really the ultimate insider look at what's going on. I've made these decisions, and these were the factors that I found compelling and interesting and persuasive. A lot of times you don't find people who are doing admissions who actually have had that experience, and so they don't really know for sure. They're using guesswork to some extent, trying to say, well, I can intuit this because it's the most logical thing. But the difference here is that you guys actually know. So I'm excited about it. Obviously, it's something you and I have been talking about for a long time. We think it's really a really cool thing. Hopefully, when we start putting pieces of it up and making it available, everybody who reads it is like, this is super helpful, because that's always the goal, is to help people out and to give more information so they know how to navigate this crazy application process that they have to go through.
I feel like Cortez landing in the Americas, burning his ships. There's no turning back now. I might not be quite as ubiquitous on social media going forward for the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, I've got to do some work myself on that. I got to get in and power on the LSAT side a little bit more, but we are working on it. It is in progress. We know all the dates for printing and everything like that. So it's happening. So I guess the ships are burning out in the bay right now.
Ships are burning. I got nothing else. I would like to put a fine point on. The early evidence is compelling that next cycle will be diminished as far as applicants versus this cycle. And that's always good news if you're an applicant.
Just less competition makes it easier for you. So on that note, let's wrap it up. I really appreciate you having me on your podcast. So thank you very much for that.
As always, we'll have you again and we'll update. Thanks, Dave.
Appreciate it, Mike. Take care.